The dispatch boxes in the House of Commons had never felt heavier. Keir Starmer gripped the green leather surface, his knuckles white against the worn material, as Kemi Badenoch rose from the opposition benches. It was January 15th, 2025, and what was about to unfold would become the most devastating Prime Minister's questions in modern Westminster history. The morning had started like any other Wednesday. At 7:23 a.m., everything changed. The call came from his Director of Communications, voice tight with panic. "Prime Minister, we have a problem. 4 survivors have resigned from the panel. They're calling the government approach toxic." Starmer set down his cup hard. This wasn't about political disagreements. This was about women who had survived hell, speaking directly against his government. "They're specifically targeting Jess Phillips. They want her removed," the voice continued. The next 2 hours blurred past. In emergency meetings, Starmer's advisors gathered in the cabinet room, their confidence replaced by panic. This was different. This was about the most vulnerable people losing faith in the government, meant to protect them. "She will bring it up at PMQs," Starmer told his team grimly. "The question is how we handle it." His legal instincts kicked in. Present facts, explain process, but as he rehearsed responses, something nagged at him. These weren't legal arguments across a courtroom. These were raw voices of trauma survivors who felt his government had failed them. As he walked through Westminster's corridors, Starmer carried more than government business. He carried knowledge that women who had found courage to speak now felt silenced by those who promised to amplify their voices. But as he approached those green benches, Starmer made a decision that would define his entire premiership. Instead of listening to survivors, he would defend his position. Instead of acknowledging their pain, he would cite achievement. Instead of accepting responsibility, he would explain process. It was a decision that would haunt him for years. Behind those famous doors of number 10, just hours earlier, Starmer had received the call that would haunt his premiership. 4 rape survivors had resigned from his government's grooming gang's inquiry panel. Not 1, not 2, 4 women who had waived their anonymity, exposed their deepest trauma to help others, had walked away from his government in disgust. But as Badenoch stood with a folder in her hands, Starmer didn't know the worst was yet to come. "Mr. Speaker," Badenoch's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. 4 victims on the rape gang's survivors panel have resigned. The words hung in the air like an executioner's act, and they've resigned because they've lost all confidence in the government's inquiry. What happened next would destroy everything Starmer thought he knew about political control. Badenoch wasn't speaking for herself. She was channeling the voice of a woman named Fiona, a survivor who had found the courage to speak, only to be silenced by the very government that promised to protect her. "I'm giving my first question to one of them. To Fiona," Badenoch continued, her voice steady but loaded with explosive power. She said, "Being dismissed and contradicted by a minister when you're telling the truth takes you right back to that feeling of not being believed all over again." The chamber fell silent. This wasn't political theatre anymore. This was the raw, unfiltered voice of a rape survivor speaking directly to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. "Fiona's question is simple," Badenoch pressed on, each word a hammer blow. "What's the point in speaking up if we're just going to be called liars?" Starmer's mind raced. In his nearly 2 decades of legal experience, he had faced hostile cross-examinations, defended impossible cases, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He wasn't facing a political opponent. He was facing the collective pain of women who had trusted his government and felt betrayed. The Prime Minister stood slowly, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. "Could I thank her for raising that on behalf of Fiona?" he began, his voice careful, measured. But already, something was wrong. The practiced politician was showing, and the chamber could sense it. "Let me give Fiona and the House my answer, Mr. Speaker, because the grooming scandal was one of the worst scandals of our time." But as Starmer spoke about inquiries and panels and procedures, everyone could see it. He was responding to a political question when a survivor had asked a human one. The disconnect was vast, and it was about to get worse. What Starmer didn't realize was that Badenoch had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had spoken directly to the survivors. She had their words, their pain, their exact quotes, and she was about to deploy them with surgical precision. "Mr. Speaker, I doubt she'll be satisfied with that answer," Badenoch replied, rising with devastating calm. "He says they could return to the panel if they wish to. Why would they do that? The government has been engaged in a briefing war against survivors." The temperature in the chamber dropped. A briefing war against rape survivors. The implications were staggering. Why don't they listen to what Elizabeth had to say? Her voice rose with controlled fury. Elizabeth, who was abused in Rotherham from the age of 14, had this to say: "The government has created a toxic environment for survivors." Toxic. The word echoed through Westminster like a gunshot. A rape survivor was calling the government of the United Kingdom toxic. The Labour benches stirred uncomfortably. Some MPs could be heard saying shame, but their protests only made things worse. They were shouting down the words of a rape survivor, and everyone could see it. Starmer's face had turned pale. This wasn't how Prime Minister's questions was supposed to work. Opposition leaders asked questions about policy, about budgets, about politics. They didn't bring the raw, unfiltered voices of trauma survivors into the chamber and force the Prime Minister to answer to them directly. Yesterday, the safeguarding minister said Elizabeth was wrong. Badenoch continued relentlessly. Who should we believe? The Prime Minister's safeguarding minister or Elizabeth? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Choose between your minister and a rape survivor. There was no good answer, and Starmer knew it. He stood again, visibly shaken now. "Mr. Speaker, let me put on record my respect for all of the survivors who've been through the most awful ordeal." The words sounded hollow, scripted, insufficient. "What we're trying to do is to get this right and have an inquiry with survivors at the heart." But as he spoke about processes and procedures, about the hard yards and wanting to press on, the disconnect became clearer. Here was a Prime Minister talking about administrative challenges, while survivors of industrial-scale rape felt abandoned by his government. Badenoch let him finish, then delivered the blow that would define his premiership. "Mr. Speaker," he says that he wants survivors to be at the heart of this. But in his first PMQs this year, he said we did not need a national inquiry. The chamber erupted. Labour MPs tried to protest, but Badenoch spoke over them with damning precision. They voted against the national inquiry 3 times. Yes, they did. Yes, they did. They voted against the national inquiry 3 times. The political ground had shifted beneath Starmer's feet. His own voting record was being used against him, and worse, it was being used in defense of rape survivors who felt his government had betrayed them. "So the victims don't believe them," Badenoch pressed on. "Now one of the victims has, contrary to what the Prime Minister's just said, they believe that the inquiry will downplay the racial and religious motivations behind their abuse." And then came the question that would haunt Starmer for years to come. Aren't the victims right when they call it a cover-up? Cover-up. The words echoed through the chamber. A rape survivor was accusing the government of the United Kingdom of covering up the racial and religious motivations behind industrial-scale child abuse. Starmer's response was technical, defensive, inadequate. He talked about Dame Louise Casey, about 1,200 reopened cases, about mandatory reporting, but everyone could see the problem. He was responding to political accusations when survivors were making moral ones. The Prime Minister tried to regain control, citing his legal background, his campaigning record, his technical achievements, but with each word, he dug himself deeper. This wasn't about administrative competence anymore. This was about whether rape survivors could trust the government. Badenoch sensed blood in the water. She had one more name, one more devastating quote from a survivor. "What would be the point of mandatory reporting?" she asked, echoing Fiona's original question. All he's saying is because 4 of those victims resigned from the survivors' panel. If they hadn't done that, they would have continued with the watering down which we all know that they were carrying out. The accusation was clear. The government was only taking action because survivors had publicly quit in protest. Without that embarrassment, they would have continued betraying the women they were supposed to protect. But Badenoch saved her most devastating moment for last. The question about judicial leadership had exposed a flaw in the government's approach, but now she was targeting something more personal. "I spoke to one of them yesterday," she said, her voice quiet but deadly. "These are victims who waived their anonymity, an incredibly difficult thing to do, and they believe the safeguarding minister has lied to them." The chamber held its breath. A minister lying to rape survivor. One of the survivors has said, "Jess Phillips needs to be removed because I don't think her conduct has been acceptable for the position she holds." Even the speaker intervened, recognizing the explosive nature of quoting attacks on sitting ministers, but the damage was done. The member for Birmingham Yardley has clearly lost the confidence of the victims. Badenoch concluded, "Does she still have the confidence of the Prime Minister?" Starmer's final response would become infamous. Faced with choosing between his minister and rape survivors, he chose his minister. Talking about Jess Phillips's experience with violence against women, he seemed oblivious to the fact that survivors were saying this experience was being used against them. But Badenoch wasn't finished. Her final question would summarize everything wrong with Starmer's leadership. How is it that whether it is rape or Chinese espionage, when he's in a position to do something about it, it's always someone else's fault? The words hung in the chamber like a verdict. Here was a prime minister who couldn't take responsibility, who couldn't answer to the people he was supposed to protect, who turned human tragedies into administrative challenges. As Starmer sat down, the weight of what had happened began to settle. This wasn't just a bad PMQs performance. This was fundamental exposure of everything wrong with his leadership approach. When rape survivors called his government toxic, he responded with technical explanations. When they demanded justice, he offered procedures. When they needed belief, he gave them bureaucracy. The footage would be watched millions of times. Political commentators would call it career-ending. Opposition researchers would use it for years. But more importantly, survivors across the country would see it as proof the political system still didn't understand their pain. In those 15 minutes, Keir Starmer hadn't just lost a political argument, he had lost moral authority to speak for the most vulnerable people in society. And everyone watching knew some things, once broken, can never be repaired. The survivors had spoken their truth. The government's response had shocked the nation. But the real shock was yet to come, because this was just the beginning of a political earthquake that would reshape British politics forever. As MPs filed out of the chamber, one truth remained. When rape survivors call your government toxic, the only acceptable response is to ask why, and to listen to the answer no matter how much it hurts. Keir Starmer had failed that test, and Britain had witnessed every painful moment. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Within minutes, clips were trending across social media. Toxic government spread faster than any communications team could contain. News editors scrambled to rearrange programming for emergency political coverage. By 3:47 p.m., the BBC's political editor was broadcasting live. This may well be remembered as the moment Keir Starmer's moral authority began to crumble. In Conservative offices, the mood was electric. Campaign strategists suddenly had more ammunition than they could process, but more significantly, phones in survivors' advocacy groups began ringing non-stop. Women who had remained silent watched a prime minister stumble over responses to other survivors and decided they could no longer trust official channel. "If Fiona and Elizabeth can't get him to listen," one survivor told a journalist, "what hope do the rest of us have?" In Downing Street, emergency meetings continued into the night. Starmer's approval ratings would drop 12 points within a week. More damaging was the qualitative shift in how voters viewed him. The competent lawyer who promised to restore trust was now seen as out of touch. Jess Phillips faced calls for resignation from across the political spectrum. Within Labour, MPs who had supported the inquiry began privately expressing concerns about leadership understanding. International media picked up the story within hours. The Washington Post titled its analysis, When political process meets human trauma, perhaps most damaging was the response from other survivors. A Manchester support group said they no longer felt confident engaging with government processes. A Leeds charity suspended cooperation until the government demonstrated genuine commitment to listening. The ripple effects would be felt for months. Future consultations with vulnerable groups would meet skepticism. The inquiry, meant to bring justice, had become a symbol of institutional failure. By midnight on January 15, 2025, 15 minutes at the dispatch box had fundamentally altered the relationship between the British government and its most vulnerable citizens. Some breaks in trust once created might never heal.